We have breaking news at this moment on just how concerned, even freaked out, law enforcement was when President Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. The New York Times has a story that just posted minutes ago, and let me read you the opening paragraph. It says, in the days after President Trump fired James B. Comey as FBI director, law enforcement officials became so concerned by the president's behavior that they began investigating whether he had been working on behalf of Russia against American interests. That's according to former law enforcement officials and others familiar with the investigation. Adam Goldman shares the byline. He joins us now by phone. Adam, this is an issue of there being a criminal investigation, and tonight, I think for the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, your reporting is that there was a counterintelligence investigation into whether the President of the United States was a threat to the United States.
Yeah, essentially that's correct. When the FBI started investigating President Trump in the days after Comey was fired, there were two elements essentially to the investigation. One was the criminal element that dealt with the possible obstruction, and the other was the counterintelligence element to this. I think while broadly people had assumed that, Mueller was looking at whether the president himself had in some way conspired or colluded with the Russians, nobody had ever laid out exactly what happened. That's what we sought to do with this story.
What exactly define a counterintelligence investigation, just so our viewers understand?
And the essence of a counterintelligence investigation is something that's a threat to national security. And typically these investigations are done quietly, clandestinely, and many, many times they don't lead to criminal charges. And the methods that the FBI uses to try to understand what an adversary might do is highly classified, and you don't see them typically brought out in Article 3 or civilian court.
Why is the idea of a counterintelligence investigation into the President of the United States, why would that information be so controversial, and why did they work so hard to keep it quiet?
Well, I think they worked really hard to keep it quiet because they wanted to understand, hey, look, the way these things are supposed to work is we're not supposed to find out about it, okay? That the FBI investigates somebody, there's a counterintelligence investigation, maybe they suspect, an individual might be working for Russia. They investigate, they do it quietly, and it goes away, just like they did with Carter Page, years ago in New York. And so the idea is that, the FBI can do the investigation, nobody hears about it, and maybe the person isn't working for a hostile country, and, they close the case and move on. In this case, everything became public.
Yes.
So it was much more difficult for the FBI to try to do what they needed to do here. But there were a couple of things that pushed the FBI over the edge, and I think it's been lost on people, is that the obstruction and the possible obstruction related to the fire in Comey, you need an object. The obstruction has to have an object, and the object was the investigation into Russian interference in 2016. That is a national security investigation.
And
And
there were two episodes. And remember how chaotic the period was following the firing of James Comey. There were two specific episodes that alarmed some of these security officials and FBI agents in the wake of that. Explain what they were.
Obviously the firing of Comey and the referencing of the Russian investigation in the president's letter laying out why Comey should be fired. The second aspect to that was I believe it was the next day, the Lester Holt interview on NBC News. He says he did it because of Russia. And, the FBI is watching this, and they say, well, he's telling us why he did it. He did this on behalf of Russia. And, within days of that, they've opened up this multi-tiered investigation that has a criminal aspect and a counterintelligence aspect to it.
And then when the president had the Oval Office meeting with the Russian ambassador, I believe it was, where he bragged about firing James Comey and called him a nut job, that was, in their minds, a vindication for the investigation?
A vindication, bolstered their reasons. The FBI, to open this investigation, needed to articulate, the reasons, the information for doing it. And then this comes out about that meeting where he calls Comey a nut job. And he says, this took great pressure off of me. The end of Comey. That in itself was, the people working on the investigation saw that as a reaffirmation the reasons into opening on the president.
Just two more very quickly. Number one, a counterintelligence investigation indicates that they were investigating whether the president was a threat, a security and intelligence threat to the United States. That's extraordinary. But just finally, there are those within the community, and you write about this.
Well, I want to clarify.
Go
Let
ahead.
me clarify something.
Go ahead.
They're investigating, and this is what Jim Baker, the former general counsel of the FBI, testified in a closed-door hearing, and we had some of his testimony in the story. To be clear, it's whether the president's actions were a threat.
Okay.
Right. It's not that. I don't think anybody is convinced that the president did this on behalf of Russia. Fired Comey, but they had to. But the act of firing, the simple act of firing Comey.
Gotcha.
Baker told Congress that was considered a threat to national security.
Is it clear whether the counterintelligence investigation was ever wrapped up?
I don't know if that's the case to date. We say that in the story. I'm sure it's something Mueller, if he writes a report, it's likely that's something he could explain it.
All right, Adam Goldman, if you will, please stick around with us. I want to also bring in CNN chief political correspondent Dana Bash and USA Today columnist Kirsten Powers is with us as well. And on the phone, FBI Supervisory Special Agent Josh Campbell, who served as a special assistant to Director Comey. Dana, first to you on this, and this gets to the article references this point. There are many within the intelligence community and certainly within the president's orbit who say that this and other things represent serious overreach by the FBI.
Potentially, and I, obviously would love to hear Josh's response to that, since he was not only working for the FBI but working for James Comey. Look, I think what is really an unknown here. Well, let's just take a step back. This is very explosive, and it's obvious why the FBI did not want anybody to know about this at all. The notion, as you were getting to with Adam, of investigating a president of the United States to see if an American president is working for the Russians is it's almost too much to wrap your mind around. Having said that, we don't know what happened. We don't know how quickly it wrapped up, if it's wrapped up, and obviously it's connected to the much larger Robert Mueller investigation. This is before.
Yes.
It seems as though the FBI started this before Robert Mueller was appointed by Rod Rosenstein.
And Mueller took it over and merged, to an extent, we believe, the counterintelligence and the criminal investigations. Josh Campbell, you were there at the time. First of all, explain to us or verify what you can about this reporting.
Yeah, so John, I have to be obviously very careful with information that I talk about that I knew when I was in the FBI. And as you mentioned, working for Director Comey, after he was fired, I continued on in my role as special assistant to the director. So again, I mentioned that just to say that, any FBI employee takes a note that they won't divulge certain things. What I will say, though, is we kind of speak kind of hypothetically about the mechanics and the impact of such an investigation. I think, first of all, it's important for the viewer to understand the mechanics. So for the FBI to open an investigation of any kind, the threshold is actually quite low. You need information or an allegation that there's been some type of violation of federal law, which is a very low threshold. You can't go on fishing expeditions. You have to have something, concrete to point to. But again, investigations are just that. You're gathering information in order to get to the bottom of what happened. So if you look at the impact here, and again, let's take ourselves back in time to that place where you had the FBI director the President of the United States, who was removing the FBI director, the person who was investigating him, which he knew about because Comey was on the record in public testimony indicating that he was investigating the Trump campaign. This was obviously something that the president knew about, and people inside the FBI knew there was this Russia investigation. The Deputy Attorney General himself knew that Russia was on the president's mind when he got rid of Comey. So as you start to piece together these elements of the puzzle, it's not beyond the possibility that people inside the FBI would say, is there a problem here as it relates to national security? And that's their job in order to get to the bottom of that and to suss out any type of threat. The one thing that I think we have to also understand is that the FBI, when it comes to the President of the United States or any type of elected official, there's actually a special category for those types of cases. They're called sensitive investigative matters. And what that means And again, that's terminology. But what that means is that if you have a certain threshold of case that involves a politician or a lawyer or a member of the clergy, a protected class, those require the highest levels of approval from the Department of Justice. So this isn't something that the FBI would open on its own and then send over some type of notice. This would require coordination with the Department of Justice, which is stunning when you think about it, because the one person who remains to this day who was there at that time was Rod Rosenstein, who was the Deputy Attorney General, and obviously he's taken a lot of slings and arrows, from the president, but he's actually stood up to a lot of these these threats from the White House and a lot of the criticisms. But if you go back in that time, the only person who was still there or who is still here now that would have been there at that time who would have known about that was the Deputy Attorney General. So as you look at the larger picture here, I agree with Dana and I agree with you, John, that this is a big deal when you think about the President of the United States being under FBI investigation. I don't know if there's any time in our lifetime or indeed in the history of the country where federal law enforcement looked down to the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and thought at least that possibly the actions of the president might threaten U.S. national security.